This is Into the Story, the podcast where you learn English with true stories from all over the world. Stories that connect us and inspire you to get where you want to go. Hello, it's Bree, your host, and I am recording this episode while visiting family in Canada. We are up in the mountains, and since I'm a person that gets easily distracted, I've come into a small office to get some work done. The office has a tiny window. Right now, I'm looking out at some big trees and in the distance, a big mountain. It's beautiful, but here's the thing. When I need a break, I step outside for just 5 minutes and everything changes. Suddenly, I can see all around me, 360 degrees. I hear the birds, I can smell the cedar trees, and then I feel the sun on my face, and that mountain just looks so much bigger. This difference between looking out a small window and stepping outside is like how we see the world. When we're stuck in our own perspective, it's like looking through that little window, narrow and limited. But when we get some perspective, it's like stepping outside and seeing the whole view. Everything becomes clearer. Today, we're going into the story of Rudge, a business English coach from Yorkshire, England. While traveling, Rob finds himself in a situation where he thought, did I just make a big mistake?
Where did I go wrong in the moments leading up to this moment? Was it staying too long, past the point of which all the tourist buses left?
Rob's story is about something many of us have experienced. That moment when you're so close to a problem that you can't see the solution. And you ask yourself, is this really happening? Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so that you never miss a new episode of the show. And if you'd like to support the show, please rate this podcast and leave a review. I really appreciate your love and support. Now it's time to look at 5 words and expressions that Rob uses in his story today. The first is upbringing. This is one word, upbringing, and it is the way that a child is raised and taught by their parents or the person who raises them. For example, her strict upbringing influenced her strong work ethic, or he credits his upbringing for a sense of responsibility. Upbringing. Next, to kick back. This is a phrasal verb that means to relax and often do nothing. For example, after a long day, she just wants to kick back and watch TV. Or he kicked back on the sofa with a good book. To kick back. Next, the main drag. This is 2 words, main drag, and it is the main street or central road in a town or city. For example, the main drag is always busy with traffic, or shops and restaurants line the main drag of the city. The main drag. Next is an expression. Without batting an eye. Without batting an eye means without showing any reaction or surprise. For example, she handled the criticism without batting an eye, or he agreed to the risky plan without batting an eye. Without batting an eye. And finally, the verb dread. D-R-E-A-D. And this means to feel great fear or anxiety about something. For example, she dreaded going to the dentist. In fact, I actually dread going to the dentist. Or he dreaded the long flight ahead. To dread. Now, Rob uses so much incredible vocabulary in today's story, so I really encourage you to go to the episode page and look at the extended vocabulary list. You will also find a transcript and a listening comprehension quiz. Okay, it's my favorite time. Let's get into the story.
I was raised in the north of England, a place called Yorkshire. We have quite a famous brand of tea, Yorkshire tea. I think the North Americans love it. I don't know. Do you have this in Canada?
I don't think I've ever heard of Yorkshire tea. The only thing I've heard of is Yorkshire pudding. Is that a thing?
Yeah. Yorkshire pudding is definitely a thing. Also confuses many visitors to the region because it's not a dessert like a pudding. It's served as part of your main dish. So that's can be quite confusing.
Yeah.
So yeah, raised in Yorkshire, lots of outdoors things that we used to do, walking in the hills, the forest, go to the seaside. My dad was an engineer, he's retired now, and so every rainy weekend, which I live in the UK, so there are a fair few of those, we used to go to the National Railway Museum. So trains are not something that I'm now interested in at all. So this was really my upbringing, the National Railway Museum and walking in the Dales.
Okay, that sounds like what I would imagine someone from Northern England does.
Yes.
Maybe not the Railway Museum, but that's very cool. Did you end up going to university? What was your early adulthood like?
So this is an interesting question because my student years, I think I was an okay student, let's put it that way. I was far more interested in getting out, seeing the world, languages, culture, shock. And this really evolved into my love of languages and traveling and really understanding that I was not an inside-the-box sort of child, so to speak. And so this really drove my teenage years to go traveling rather than studying for exams. So I was going to Cuba and Norway, North Africa, around the world rather than thinking about exams.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was a moment that you went on your travels. Can you tell us where you went, who you were with?
Sure. So one of the most memorable moments that I had, this was not during my teen years, this was probably my early to mid-20s. I distinctly remember I was on holiday within the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa region. I'm on a break for 7, maybe 10 days. I'm exploring the cities in this country and just really kicking back, contemplating my options for the next couple of years. On this one particular afternoon, I find myself in the nation's capital. It's late afternoon and I'm flying back the next day. It's hot, dry. I haven't eaten because I miss lunch because I'm bartering with the local traders about leather belts and coin trays and things like this. And so my hydration level and blood sugar is starting to slide a little bit. However, successful. I exited the market onto the main drag where I was dropped off earlier that day in the morning. The first thing that strikes me is the fact that I'm now one of the only tourists left in the mid to late afternoon on the main drag of this city. And I can see that I'm one of the only tourists left. There are one or two being sort of hustled along by their guides and put into tourist taxis. But the drop-off point further down the road, where the tourist bus left me earlier that day, was empty. There was no buses there, and the point had been collapsed. All the boards had been taken, so it was completely closed down. So in my sunburnt and fatigued state and in need of options, I decided to look around for a taxi rank, a local taxi rank. I found one just down the street, so I joined the back of this 20-something person queue. I slumped down against the wall and just prepared to wait this out, inspecting my purchases and thinking, could I have knocked the market trader down a bit further? I'm then brought out of this by a bony sort of tap on the shoulder. and it's the guy in front of me in the queue saying something to me that I don't understand. But he's waving over his shoulder at the rest of the queue. So I look round the guy in the queue, and I see these 20 faces looking back at me. The whole queue is now staring back at me. So I follow this line of faces along, and there is a group of young lads at the front of this queue gesticulating and waving me into this taxi. And I'm thinking, well, you know, there are many people ahead of me. I thought, I'm happy to wait this out. But everybody insisting in the queue, I could see that I wasn't going to win that battle. So I very gratefully walked to the front of the queue and stood behind the car. This taxi had seen better days, but doesn't matter. I got in the back of this taxi, slid over to the middle bench in the back of this taxi, and as you do, you just look around the taxi and look for the meter, make sure there is one. And the first thing that really stood out about this taxi was not the fact that it was leaning over to one side, because my driver was a man mountain who had successfully folded himself into this car, but also there were no seatbelts, and the entire dashboard was lit up like a Christmas tree. All the warning lights were on, which, you know, I'm quite happy to see, because it's all culture, and I tend to like this sort of thing. So we then sort of take off away from the curb. I tell him the hotel name, he knows it, and we start to make our way down the street, bouncing from one bump to another, which isn't doing my sunburn on the back of my legs any good. We start to pass all the local market traders. We go past the bus stop where I was dropped off earlier that day. And the aromas from dinner are now starting to come through the car window. And I am salivating like crazy and imagining what I'm going to have for my last meal at the hotel when we get back, daydreaming about it. I am knocked out of this daydream as the taxi veers violently off the main drag and down a side street. This is surprising to me, as we are now, as far as I can make out, heading in the wrong direction of the road on the outskirts of the city that we're aiming for. I lean forward and politely remind the driver in my best slow, loud English of the name of my hotel. And he just, without batting an eyelid, is like, shortcut. I was like, this guy speaks English. Excellent. So he's shortcut. So that sort of allays my fears for a little bit. However, apartments and shops turn into makeshift dwellings and properties, and the tarmac goes from tarmac to dirt and gravel and sand.
And this is the moment when Rob starts to think that something is very wrong. A strong feeling of fear hits his stomach. His mind fills with questions.
Where did I go wrong in the moments leading up to this moment? Was it staying too long past the point of which all the tourist buses left? Was it using a taxi queue that was only designed for locals? Was it the four men trying to get me into this specific taxi? As I'm thinking about this, the driver receives a phone call and picks up the phone and starts this heated debate with the guy on the end of the phone, or whoever it is on the end of the phone, which again, I'm not, too bothered about. If it wasn't for the fact he was staring at me for almost the entire journey as he's looking back at me driving, and we're just disappearing into the suburbs of this city.
Rob starts to panic. Everything he sees around him makes him think one thing.
What if this was a setup? I had heard stories before, stories of tourists being led astray, never to be seen again. My surroundings had become more remote, and the isolation only heightened that paranoia. The driver, with his massive frame and unreadable expression, didn't exactly help either. So this deep dread is now really driving forward some quite radical decision-making. I'm now considering my options. I shuffle over to the edge of the vehicle and I'm looking out the window and thinking, 30 miles an hour, like, what are the injuries I'm going to sustain? And just thinking, like, tuck and roll. Open the door, tuck and roll. And this is what I'm thinking.
What would you do if you were in the back of a taxi and believed that the driver was taking you somewhere dangerous? Would you say something? Call someone? Rob has moved from the middle seat to the window seat, and he's looking down at the road rushing by. He's thinking about jumping out. His hand is on the door handle, ready to open it.
We've now entered into past the suburbs of the city where we're going through farmland, farms, desert, sort of just a mishmash of land, patchwork of land. As I reach for the door handle and begin to position myself to throw myself from the rear of this moving vehicle, we burst through the side of a crop line onto the side of a highway where we nearly miss a couple of vehicles. And this is not just a highway, it's the highway that we had come in on. And the driver sort of smugly shortcut.
Rob quickly pulls his hand away from the door handle and looks up, catching the driver's eye in the review mirror. And they're back on the main road, heading straight to his hotel.
And it was that moment where I was just thinking, you missed it. You missed all the context. This guy was just doing the shortcut all along, but your preconceived ideas really started to affect the way you were going to behave. You were just about to get out of a moving vehicle. So anyway, 10 minutes later, we're rolling into the hotel district. He gets out of the car and he starts some banter with the bellboys, laughing and joking. First smile that I'd seen, actually, since I'd met him. And as I go to pay the guy, there was this twinkle in his eye about he knew the psychological trauma that he'd been causing me for the last 20 minutes or so. And that was that. So the key learning points for me were, number one, and I think my mother bought me a mug after this event. She bought me a mug with a saying on it. Avoid making irrevocable decisions when tired or hungry. This is absolutely true, and I'm still not very good at that now. And the second learning point, it's a little bit wider. The CIA did a study, and this study was around perception and perspective. And they found that 98% of people live their lives through perception. Perception only. They are perception first. And only 2% of individuals live their life through perspective, acquiring the right perspective. And what does that mean for us as language learners, coaches, teachers, tutors? We can pull that through to see that culture shock, miscommunications, misunderstandings, and all these other prickly situations that we find ourselves in as language learners and speakers of second and third and fourth languages is the fact that we are relying almost entirely, all of the time, on our perception of the events instead of the perspective. I was worried about disappearing and never being seen again, when actually all it was a shortcut because the driver didn't want to sit in traffic any more than I did, and he just wanted to get paid and get back on with the next job. And so this shift from perception to perspective is something that I really learnt that day as I burst through the side of that crop line onto the highway, nearly contacting a vehicle. And I'm thinking, okay, that was perspective I needed there, not perception.
If you remember one thing from this story, remember this. Trying new things changes how we see the world. When we visit new places, even if it's in our country, close to where we live, or we meet different people, we start to see things in new ways. This helps us move from that narrow view to a bigger, clearer understanding. The more we experience, the easier it is to see the whole picture. Rob Rudge is a business English coach who helps professionals communicate better at work. He teaches that good communication is about technique, not just vocabulary. If you would like to know more about Rob, you can visit energeticenglish.com or follow the links in the episode description below. Okay, folks, if you enjoy this podcast, you will definitely enjoy my newsletter too. Every few weeks, I'll send you a quick email with practical tips and fascinating topics from the world of psychology and ways to make your life better. Just head over to intothestorypodcast.com and click subscribe. It's completely free. Okay, that's all for today. Until the next episode, I hope that you have a good time, or at least a good story to tell.